This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today I'm joined by best-selling author and barrister Simon Michael, whose Charles Holborne legal thriller series has earned him the nickname the British John Grisham. His latest novel, The French Vendetta, is the 11th book in the acclaimed series and takes readers beyond the London courtroom into rural France, where decades after World War II, old loyalties, buried secrets, and unresolved guilt continue to shape the lives of an entire community. Combining legal authenticity, gripping historical fiction, and compelling mystery, The French Vendetta explores memory, justice, collaboration, resistance, and the price people pay when history refuses to stay buried. I'm delighted to welcome Simon Michael to the Speaking of Writers podcast. Great to have you here.
Hi, Steve. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me.
So, The French Vendetta, what first inspired this particular story, and why did you want Charles Holborne investigating a mystery in rural France rather than London?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting story. Now, a number of threads all came together. I was lucky enough to own a house, an old farmhouse in the southwest of France for a period of about 10 years. Beautiful place, and lovely, lovely people. But I stumbled across what appeared to be a secret of some sort, where certain families would not talk with other families in the village. And I asked what was going on. And I learned that some of them had supported Vichy, the French Nazi regime during the war, and others had actually fought on the side of the resistance, the Maquis in the hills. So there was that tension between them. And then I stumbled across, I was out driving one afternoon, beautiful hillsides full of sunflowers and trees. And right there in the middle, between two fields of sunflowers, was this tiny cemetery, rather like the cemeteries you get in northern France, the long lines of white graves and so on.
Mm.
But this one had several stars of David, so Jewish dead in this sort of the middle of this Catholic French area. I thought that this is very bizarre. And so I started digging, and it turns out that was the site of a massacre of the resistance fighters during the war, which only added to the ill feeling that lived on a generation later in this village. So those are the threads that brought the story together. As to why I wanted to take Charles out of the gangland streets of London, that's more difficult to answer. Anyone who knows the series will know that each book is another year during the 60s. I'm gradually working my way through the 60s and 70s. And so my protagonist and his family, they get older, their circumstances change. And at the end of the previous book, Charles and his live-in lover got married. And I thought, well, what do people do when they get married? They go on honeymoon. So I decided to send them to France for their honeymoon. And that's how the whole thing came about. It's fair to say that some of my regular readers did not like the change. They were really upset. Where are the gangsters, they said. Where are the mean streets of, the corrupt mean streets of London? And I had to say, well, okay, let's just treat this as Charles's holiday. I'll be back on the mean streets of London in the next book.
Although this is book 11, new readers can jump right in here. What makes Charles such an enduring character after all these novels?
I can't really put my finger on it. I mean, I get a lot of emails and messages from readers who say, "What's going on in Charles and Sally's life?" And I'm worried about them. And they appear to have got a sort of three-dimensionality that others don't. I think it's because he's a genuine guy. I mean, he's got his faults. Um, in the beginning of the series, he's not very good with women, and he's a product of his time. And he's a bit of a dinosaur. I mean, the series Mad Men, the very popular series in the States, that shows, what life was really like in the 60s. Women had to fight to get a profession. In the UK, they weren't even allowed to take out loans unless their husbands authorized them. They couldn't buy a house on their own. I mean,
Mm.
this is only a short while ago, you know, and the world was completely different. Charles was a bit of a dinosaur in the early books, and he gradually grows up and grows older. But I think people they warm to the fact that he's no plaster saint. He's got serious issues,
Yeah.
but he does his best.
He's a fascinating protagonist, a barrister, former boxer, and someone who understands both the courtroom and the criminal world too. Why do those contradictions make him such an effective investigator?
Yeah, and there is something in there. I mean, he's had one foot in the criminal camp since he was a teenager, and he grew up with. Now, these guys are not very well known in the States, but there are a couple of true life criminals called the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie Cray. They were certainly in Ronnie's case, he was a psychopath, and they were responsible for almost all big crime that occurred in that period in London. And I have him growing up with them. So that he was friends. He used to box at the same gym as them. And he dabbled in crime as well. And if it hadn't been for the fact that they had what they call over here a good war, in that, he got decorated as a fighter pilot, and as a result, the government, I think this happens in the States too, there are various graduate entry schemes for people who fought for their country. And Charles was offered such a scheme and found himself at Cambridge. And of course, that changed his life. He was no longer a working class, slightly dodgy boxer come criminal. He had the opportunity of the profession. So I think and rather like me personally, um, I very often sympathize more with my clients when I was at the bar than I did with the people I was working with. I have very similar roots to Charles Holborne's. Working class family, no money, had to do all sorts of jobs to be able to get myself through university. And so like Charles, I have a certain sympathy for people who are at the bottom of the pile.
Simon, how did you become a writer?
Well, I suspect if you asked most writers, they would say they had no choice in the matter. They are, they have to write. It's part of who they are. And it was the same for me. I didn't write always with the idea of being published, but throughout my childhood, I was writing short stories. When I got to college, I founded the Review Society, which is basically it's a charity where you put on sketches and short plays and so on to raise money for charity. So I was writing plays and sketches and so on. And then once I got to the bar, I was thrown all these fantastic ideas because I was actually dealing with the cases on a daily basis. So that they were crying out to be written.
Mm.
So I guess I've always been a writer. And I suspect if all my publishers suddenly said, no, thank you very much, we've had enough from you, I would still be a writer. I have no choice.
When you were a child writing those short stories, was there a teacher, a family member who inspired you to and said, Simon, you're a pretty good storyteller here?
Yeah, there was one event actually, just one. I wrote a science fiction, a sort of short story, and it got read out at us in the assembly at school. I guess I might have been 11 or
Mm.
12. And for the first time in my life, there was applause and people liked it. And I thought, oh, maybe I can do that. And it was, and I still have that, in the back of my head. And it was the first time I actually thought, okay, I might just have a little talent here. So yeah, I remember. It wasn't a particular teacher, but it was that event.
Had to be a great moment at such a young
Yeah,
age.
yeah.
This novel asks whether a war ever truly ends. Was that the central question you wanted readers to wrestle with?
Yes. Um, this happened. I mean, this really did happen in France. They had a thing called the épuration sauvage, the savage purification. And in the days and weeks following the German withdrawal, this is long before the end of the war. This is when the Germans were being pushed out of France, mile by mile. There was a huge cataclysm of people taking revenge against those who, in their communities, who they believed had supported the Vichy regime. Sometimes it was just women who'd had relationships with German soldiers. Other times it was farms who had sold their food to the German forces. And other times it was people who actually worked with the Vichy regime to kill their fellow villagers. So it was a huge scale. But people were taken out and shot with little or no judicial involvement at all. If they were lucky, there might be a kangaroo court, but sometimes they were just simply taken out and shot by vengeful neighbors. Thousands were killed. It's not very well known about outside of France, but what I stumbled across in the village where I used to have this house showed me that a generation later, people still couldn't live with one another, and there was nothing to break through that impasse. And I liked the idea of there being a trial where Charles is forced to use his legal skills in a completely foreign setting where he doesn't even speak the language. And this having of this trial heals a generational wound. It's very often people say, do you know how you want the book to end? And my answer very often is, I don't know how I want it to end in terms of a plot, but I know the emotion I want to generate in the reader. And in this case, I wanted to generate the emotion of sort of homecoming, a sort of resolution of disputes.
Hmm. This village in the south of France,
Yeah.
Bezerac, right?
Yeah.
Almost feels like another character in the book. How did you build the atmosphere of suspicion, silence, and decades-old resentment too?
Well, I mean, I cheated because this is based on the village where I had a house. So the description of the bar and the central dusty square and the heat beating down and the incredible colors, especially in the evenings when as the light begins to fade, it's like it's painted in Technicolor. So all I had to do was remember what it was like to be there. So I confess this wasn't entirely made up. I was just using my memory. It is a beautiful part of the world. Most people, most tourists don't tend to go down to the southwest corner of France where it borders on Spain. It's not one of the most popular areas, but it is outstandingly beautiful. And the people are lovely,
Mm. The book
as
shifts
is the food.
as it the food.
Yes.
Yeah.
Food is excellent.
The book shifts between occupied France during World War II, you touched on that earlier, and 1970. How challenging was it, Simon, to balance those timelines while keeping the suspense building?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's the first time I'd ever done that. In one of my earlier books called The Lighter Man, I have flashbacks to the war, which involve Charles when he was a teenager and he was then working on the Thames as a lighterman. Um, but they are only the occasional flashbacks, maybe a couple of chapters. Whereas this was, as you know, alternate chapters right until the point where the book sort of takes off. So about halfway through, maybe two-thirds of the way through. And I found it quite an interesting challenge to think with the 1940 hat on and then a 1970 hat. In fact, one of my readers got in touch recently to say, having read the book, they went back and reread it, skipping every second chapter. She said she read chapter 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and so on. And then having done that, she went back to read chapters 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. That's not actually how I wrote it. I wrote it, alternate chapters. But it's an interesting skill, and I have a greater admiration than I used to have for those writers who do write with dual timelines. It's a particular you've got to be careful and get into each period independently.
One of the novel's strongest themes is memory. People remember events differently and sometimes intentionally. Why does that idea fascinate you?
I think that comes partly from my practice as a trial attorney. So you do get liars. There are people who are going into the witness box, they take the oath, and they are lying. But the vast majority of people, when they've got competing accounts, they're not lying. They're just remembering differently or misremembering. And most trial attorneys would say there is no one more compelling and believable than someone who's absolutely certain they're right, but they are wrong. And you come across it every day in courtrooms when you're doing trial work. And I think that's always fascinated me, how people can be absolutely convinced they're right, and yet they haven't seen what they thought they saw, or they've misinterpreted it. Or one of the things I did in the book actually is I was can't remember if it was this book or another one, is people get, for example, timings and distances completely wrong. So one witness will say, "Oh yes, I watched him for a period of well, it must have been 10 seconds." And then I say, "Okay, I'm going to start my stopwatch. I'm going to shout go." I'll do this in court, with the jury there. And I say, when you get to the end of the period, you think you actually saw that event, shout out, and I'll stop the stopwatch. 9 times out of 10, it's no more than 2 seconds.
Mhm.
And yet they've imagined it was 10. And they were telling the truth as far as they could see it, but they just plain wrong.
You write that communities sometimes rewrite history simply to survive. How important was exploring that moral gray area rather than presenting heroes and villains?
Yeah, I think it happens a lot. I mean, they say that the winners are the ones who write the history. And it becomes the received wisdom. But the truth is that it's very rarely like that. I have always seen the world in shades of grey. I think it is it's wrong to imagine that the good is wear the white hats and the bad is wear the black hats. Everyone is wearing different shades of grey, and and you only have to look at the politics, for example, of the Middle East now to know that there are completely different accounts of what's happened and what is now currently happening. And it'll depend on who writes the histories as to which one is given prominence. So it's something that's always interested me. And I can't actually tell you where that interest first came from, but I've always had it. I've always known that you have to be careful believing anything. Everything requires corroboration.
Mm. Your novels explore class prejudice, anti-Semitism, institutional corruption, and power. Were those themes especially important to include in this book, The French Vendetta?
Well, I don't do it as a matter of, I don't, it very often is unconscious. All of the books deal with prejudice. And I think that's partly because I suffered from it in my career. Um, I don't like bullies. I think that's basically it. I don't like bullies. And whether the bully might be, the prevailing social class who press down on others, or governments, or whatever. So in all of my books, whether I like it or not, there's an element of the underdog fighting back. So, and it's not just class prejudice, which is certainly there, or anti-Semitism. In a couple of books, I deal with before 1968, it was still illegal to be a gay man in Britain, and you would go to prison for it. And so I deal with that as well. And then the book I'm currently writing, book 12 in a series, I'm dealing with the women's lib movement and the way that women had to fight so hard to be able to live the lives they wanted. They didn't want to be mums and just be at home and look after families. They wanted a career, but they had to fight for it. So that all those things come out in all of my books, and I suspect whatever I write, it'll always be there. It's not kind of it's not a deliberate choice. It's
Mm.
just something that's in my psyche, and it keeps coming out in the books.
Simon, historical crime fiction continues to attract a huge audience. Why do you think
Mm.
readers enjoy mysteries that are rooted in real historical events?
It's a good question. I often ask myself that question. I think people like true crime stories,
Yeah.
um, particularly because it. I think people are frightened. It's a bit like being on a roller coaster, or a scary ride in some theme park. It's dangerous, but you're going to be okay. And in the same way, people they have a sort of a horrified fascination with murder, rape, and other really violent, nasty crimes, but they love to know that goodness will succeed. And so the true crime story, which usually ends with someone being arrested and charged and prosecuted, it kind of resolves the conflict for people. They like to see that. Um, but I have an issue with what is called true crime because, as you know, there are hundreds of, if not thousands, of podcasts and TV shows and radio broadcasts that to deal with true crime and actual events that have occurred. And I think the listeners always imagine that they're actually getting it, the real stuff from the horse's mouth. And yet, every decision, every cut, every camera angle, it's all been edited. Someone, either the producer or the writer, has made a decision at every single stage what to cut out, what to leave in, whether they have that character or they just combine those two characters because it makes it easier. So it isn't really true crime. It is very much closer to what I do, which is to fictionalize a story and make it ring, give it a shape and let it and an arc to it. So I think the truth is people love it because it reassures them. But I do also think they need to describe it more accurately. I don't, it's never quite true crime. It's true crime plus editing.
Mm. Simon, what do you hope readers take away after turning the final page of the French Vendetta?
Yeah, another good question. Um, I want them to like Charles. I mean, it ends for him, it ends on a high note, as you know. And so um, I also I this may sound like a slightly odd way of answering this question. Um, my favorite author is Charles Dickens.
Mm.
And the reason I like Dickens so much is because he deals in the same way as I did, but obviously much better, with injustice and the powerlessness of the small people, kept down by people with money and by the courts and so on. It is always kindness of the smaller characters that wins the day.
Mm.
Um, the ordinary folk who essentially are kind and caring for one another. And I think kindness is probably the most important thing in the world. And in the end of the French Vendetta, Charles's strength and his kindness have eventually brought about a resolution, a reconciliation between the two sides in the village. And I wanted people to see that it's possible. That with trying to imagine yourself into another person's shoes for a short time is a very good way of resolving difference.
He is Simon Michael. His outstanding new novel is The French Vendetta, the 11th installment in the acclaimed Charles Holborne legal thriller series. If you enjoy historical mysteries, courtroom drama, and stories that explore justice, memory, and the lasting consequences of war, this is a novel you won't want to miss. Simon, thank you for joining me.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks, Steve.
And thank you for watching and for listening to the Speaking of Writers podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, I'm Steve Richards.